February 10th, 1996. A 14-year-old girl walked out of her home in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and vanished. For 10 years, search teams combed the industrial towns along the Monongahela River. Her face appeared on milk cartons, missing children websites, and telephone poles across 3 states. Investigators followed hundreds of leads that went nowhere. But the answer was never far away. It was 2 miles from her father's house, hidden behind a locked door, where a child disappeared into a decade of silence. The man responsible wasn't a stranger. He wore a uniform. He carried keys. He was paid to keep children safe. This is the story of Tanya Nicole Kach, the girl who vanished in plain sight. And when the truth finally emerged, it would expose a decade of manipulation, institutional failure, and a crime that began not with force, but with betrayal. McKeesport, Pennsylvania, sits along the Monongahela River, 15 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. In the mid-1990s, it was a town adjusting to economic decline. The steel mills that once anchored the community had closed years earlier, leaving behind rows of aging houses and families working multiple jobs to stay afloat. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children played on quiet streets until the streetlights came on, where parents believed their towns were safe. McKeesport wasn't perfect, but it felt stable, predictable, manageable. Tanya Nicole Kach was born on October 14th, 1981. Her early childhood was ordinary in most ways. Her father, Jerry Kach, worked as a butcher. Her mother, Sherry, stayed home when Tanya was young, then took work when she could find it. They lived modestly like most families in town, getting by, but never quite getting ahead. But beneath the surface, the family was fracturing. Jerry and Sherry's marriage deteriorated through Tanya's childhood, marked by arguments that grew louder and more frequent. By the time Tanya turned 13, the tension had become unbearable. In 1995, her parents divorced. The separation was bitter and contentious, fought out in lawyers' offices and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Custody was awarded to Jerry. Sherry moved out and gradually faded from Tanya's daily life, maintaining only sporadic contact. Tanya found herself caught between 2 parents who were too consumed by their own pain to fully see hers. She missed her mother, but resented the abandonment. She lived with her father, but felt like an inconvenience. Jerry moved in with his girlfriend, Joanne, in a modest home in McKeesport. Tanya came with him, a quiet teenager trying to navigate a household where she felt increasingly unwelcome. The relationship between Tanya and her stepmother was strained from the beginning. There was tension over rules, over space, over whose home it really was. Tanya began acting out. She tested boundaries, stayed out past curfew, talked back. When that didn't get the attention she craved, she escalated. She started experimenting with alcohol and marijuana. She skipped school. She ran away from home several times, disappearing for a day or 2 before returning. Each time she ran, Jerry called the police to report her missing. Each time, she came back. It became a pattern that the local police began to recognize. Troubled teen, family problems, chronic runaway. The officers would file reports, but there was only so much they could do. Tanya always returned, and there was no evidence of neglect or danger in the home. By the fall of 1995, Tanya's behavior had become almost predictable. Run away, return, repeat. It was exhausting for everyone involved, but no one knew how to break the cycle. What no one realized was that this pattern would later make it nearly impossible to recognize when Tanya's disappearance was different, when she vanished for real. In September 1995, Tanya enrolled as an 8th grader at Cornell Middle School in McKeesport. She was small for her age, quiet, and struggled to fit in. The social hierarchies of middle school are brutal for everyone, but for Tanya, they were particularly devastating. She became a target for bullies almost immediately. Groups of girls mocked her clothes, her hair, the way she walked. They spread rumors, excluded her from conversations, made sure she knew she didn't belong. The harassment escalated from verbal taunts to physical intimidation. She was shoved in hallways, cornered in bathrooms, threatened after school. Tanya tried to tell teachers, But middle school staff are overwhelmed and often miss what happens in the margins. The bullying continued unchecked. Tanya felt invisible to the adults who were supposed to protect her and hyper-visible to the peers who tormented her. She started skipping classes to avoid the harassment. She would hide in stairwells, sit in empty corners of the building, or slip out through side exits when no one was looking. Attendance became sporadic. Her grades dropped. Teachers noted her absences, but attributed them to the family problems everyone knew about. School became a place of survival rather than learning. She had no close friends, no support system, no safe space. She felt utterly alone. Then she met Thomas Hose. Thomas Hose was 38 years old, a security guard employed by the McKeesport Area School District. His job was to patrol the hallways, monitor students, and maintain order. He wore a uniform, carried a radio, and had keys to every door in the building. Students were supposed to see him as an authority figure, someone who kept them safe. With most students, Hose was stern and distant. He enforced rules, wrote up violations, and maintained professional boundaries. But with Tanya, he was different. One afternoon, he found her skipping class in a stairwell. Instead of riding her up or escorting her back to class, he sat down beside her. He asked if she was okay. She was surprised. Adults usually lectured her or ignored her. They didn't ask how she was feeling. She told him about the bullies, about feeling unsafe in the hallways, about not wanting to be at school. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he understood. He said school could be difficult, that some kids were cruel, that she didn't deserve to be treated that way. Then he said something that would change everything. "You can talk to me anytime." It seemed kind, protective even. Tanya had no way of knowing it was the beginning of a process called grooming. Over the following weeks, their conversations became routine. Hose would pull her out of class, claiming he needed to speak with her about a behavioral issue or a security concern. They would sit in empty stairwells or quiet corners of the building, and he would let her talk. He never reported her absences. He never called her parents. Instead, he positioned himself as her ally, the one adult in the building who cared about her well-being. He created a dynamic where she felt indebted to him, where she believed he was protecting her from consequences she deserved. He began bringing her small gifts: cigarettes, which he knew she smoked, candy, small amounts of money. He asked about her home life, and she told him about the tension with her stepmother, the fights with her father, the feeling that no one wanted her around. He told her she was special. He told her she was mature for her age. He told her that most adults wouldn't understand her, but he did. He was isolating her, positioning himself as the only person who truly cared, creating a dependency that would make it easier to manipulate her later. Tanya didn't see it. She saw kindness. She saw attention. She saw someone who made her feel valued for the first time in months. It happened in late 1995 in a stairwell on a cold afternoon. Tanya had skipped class again to avoid a confrontation with a group of girls who had threatened her. She was sitting on the steps, arms wrapped around her knees, when Thomas Hose found her. He sat down beside her, closer than he usually did. He asked what was wrong. She told him about the threats, about being scared to go to her next class, about feeling like she couldn't handle it anymore. He put his hand on her shoulder. Then he leaned in and kissed her. Tanya froze. She didn't pull away. She didn't push him back. She sat there, stunned and confused, while a 38-year-old man in a position of authority crossed a boundary that should never be crossed. When he pulled back, he smiled and said quietly, "You should leave. Be with me forever." The words hung in the air. Tanya's mind raced. Part of her knew this was wrong. She was 14. He was an adult. He was a school employee. But another part of her, the part that felt unwanted and invisible, heard something different. She heard someone saying they wanted her. Over the next few weeks, Hose continued to push boundaries. He told her that her parents didn't really care about her, that they were too caught up in their own problems to notice whether she was there or not. He said he could give her a better life, a place where she wouldn't have to deal with bullies or fights or feeling like a burden. He painted a picture of escape, of freedom, of a life where someone actually wanted her around. For a 14-year-old girl who felt abandoned by her mother, resented by her stepmother, and overlooked by her father, it sounded like salvation. She didn't understand what he was really offering. She didn't understand that this wasn't love or protection. It was predation. By early February 1996, Jose convinced her to run away. He told her he had a plan. She would come to his house, stay with him, and they would be together. She didn't fully comprehend what that meant, but she agreed. On the morning of February 10th, 1996, Tanya packed a small bag with clothes and a few personal items. She left no note for her father. She told no one where she was going. She simply walked out of the house and didn't come back. Jerry and Joan woke to find her gone. At first, they assumed it was another one of her disappearances, the same pattern they had seen before. She would be gone for a day or two, then return, sullen and uncommunicative. But this time was different. A day passed, then 2, then 3. By the 4th day, Jerry was worried. This felt different. On February 14th, 1996, he filed an official missing persons report with the McKeesport Police Department. By then, Tanya was already locked inside Thomas Jose's house, 2 miles from her father's home. She had no idea that she wouldn't leave for 10 years. When Tanya Kach was officially reported missing on February 14th, 1996, the McKeesport Police Department opened a standard missing person case. Detective assigned to the case noted Tanya's history of running away, which immediately shaped how the investigation proceeded. Her description was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. 14 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, approximately 100 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing jeans and a winter jacket. The information was distributed to law enforcement agencies across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Flyers were printed with Tanya's photograph. Her face, smiling in a school picture, appeared on bulletin boards at grocery stores, post offices, and community centers throughout McKeesport and the surrounding towns. The caption read simply, "Have you seen this girl?" The first week of the investigation brought several reported sightings. A teenager matching Tanya's description was seen at a bus station in Pittsburgh. Another was spotted at a shopping mall in Monroeville. A gas station attendant in West Virginia thought he recognized her. Each lead was investigated and ruled out. None of them were Tanya. Detectives interviewed her friends, though Tanya had few close relationships at school. They spoke with her teachers, who confirmed she had been struggling academically and had significant attendance problems. They questioned family members, neighbors, anyone who might have information about where she could have gone. They also interviewed Thomas Jose. As the security guard at Cornell Middle School and one of the last adults known to have interacted with Tanya regularly, Jose was a logical person to question. Detectives asked if he had noticed anything unusual about Tanya's behavior in the days before her disappearance, if she had mentioned running away, if she had said anything about where she might go. Jose expressed concern for Tanya's safety. He said she was a troubled student who often skipped class and seemed to have problems at home. He said he had tried to mentor her, to encourage her to stay in school and make better choices. He offered to help with the investigation in any way he could. The detectives thanked him and moved on. There was nothing in his demeanor or his statements that raised suspicion. He was a school employee, a trusted authority figure, someone whose job was to protect children. It never occurred to them to search his house. Jerry Kach did everything he could to find his daughter. He appeared on local television news programs, making emotional pleas for Tanya to come home or for anyone with information to contact police. He distributed flyers at truck stops and rest areas along major highways, hoping someone had seen her. He contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which added Tanya's case to their database and created age progression images showing what she might look like as she aged. But as weeks turned into months, the case lost momentum. Police resources were stretched across multiple investigations. The media moved on to newer stories. Tanya's flyers faded on telephone poles, their edges curling, her face barely visible beneath layers of weather damage and newer postings. By the end of 1996, the active search had effectively ended. Tanya Kach became another name in a database, another missing child case that went cold, another family living with unanswered questions. Jerry never stopped believing she was alive. He kept a box of her belongings in his closet, school photos, report cards, a stuffed animal she had loved as a child. He called the police department every few months to check if there were any updates. The answer was always the same. No new leads, no new information. Case remains open. At Cornell Middle School, life continued. New students enrolled, teachers moved on, and the hallways filled with different faces. Thomas Hose continued working as a security guard, patrolling the same corridors where he had groomed Tanya, still trusted, still unnoticed. 2 miles away, Tanya sat in a locked bedroom, listening to footsteps on the floor below, wondering if anyone was still looking for her. The house where Thomas Hose lived was unremarkable from the outside. It was a 2-story home on a quiet residential street in McKeesport, the kind of place where neighbors mowed their lawns on weekends and waved to each other in passing. It belonged to Hose's elderly parents, Howard and Eleanor, both in their 70s. Hose lived there with them and his adult son, who was 22 years old. On the day Tanya arrived, Hose brought her in through a side entrance when his parents were out. He led her upstairs to his second-floor bedroom and closed the door behind her. Then he explained the rules. She was not to leave the room, not for any reason. She was to remain completely silent. If his parents heard her, if his son discovered her, if anyone found out she was there, Hose told her they would both be in serious trouble. He said the police would arrest her for running away. He said her parents would send her to a juvenile detention facility. He said no one would believe her if she told them the truth about why she was there. She believed him. She had no reason not to. He was an adult, an authority figure, someone who had positioned himself as her protector. She trusted that he knew better than she did. For the first 4 years, Tanya's existence was confined entirely to that bedroom. It was small, barely large enough for a bed, a dresser, and a chair. The windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out natural light. The door was locked from the outside. Hose brought her food, usually leftovers from family meals, served cold hours after they were prepared. He provided a container for her to use when she needed the bathroom. He taught her which floorboards creaked and instructed her to avoid stepping on them when anyone else was home. She was allowed out of the room twice a week, late at night, after everyone else had gone to bed, to shower quickly and quietly in the upstairs bathroom. She learned to move in complete silence, like a ghost in someone else's house. The isolation was absolute. She had no television, no radio, no books, no contact with the outside world, no sunlight, no fresh air. The only voice she heard was Hose's. The only face she saw was his. He visited her every day, sometimes multiple times. During these visits, he reinforced the same messages over and over. No one is looking for you. Your family doesn't want you. You're safe here with me. If you try to leave, you'll be arrested. If you tell anyone, you'll be taken away and punished. The manipulation was constant and systematic. He was creating a psychological prison that was just as effective as the locked door. Tanya cried often during those first years. She thought about her father, wondering if he was searching for her, if he missed her, if he even noticed she was gone. She thought about her mother, though they hadn't been close. She thought about school, about the girls who had bullied her, about the life she had left behind. She thought about escaping. But where would she go? Hose had convinced her that the world outside was hostile, that everyone would blame her for running away, that returning would only lead to worse punishment. So she stayed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. She turned 15 in that room, then 16, then 17. Childhood slipped away in silence and darkness. By the time she turned 18, Tanya had spent 4 years locked in a bedroom in a house where a family lived their normal lives one floor below, completely unaware of her existence. Then in the year 2000, something changed. Hose decided it was time to give Tanya a new identity. He told his elderly parents that he had a girlfriend, a woman named Nikki Allen, who would be moving in with them. His parents, trusting their son and unaware of the truth, accepted the story without question. They met Nikki briefly, a quiet young woman who smiled politely and stayed close to their son. They had no reason to suspect she was the missing girl whose face had appeared on flyers years earlier. To them, she was just their son's girlfriend. With her new identity, Tanya was allowed limited freedom. She could leave the bedroom when Hose's parents were out of the house. She could walk around downstairs, watch television, sit in the living room. But the rules remained strict. She was not to speak to neighbors, not to make phone calls, not to answer the door, not to draw any attention to herself. If she broke the rules, Hose told her there would be severe consequences. He reminded her constantly that she was still in danger, that the police were still looking for her, that her only safety was in staying hidden. For the next 6 years, Tanya lived in a strange half-existence. She was no longer locked in a room, but she was still a prisoner. The bars were psychological now, rather than physical, but they were just as real. She could walk to the corner store to buy groceries, but she couldn't tell the clerk her real name. She could attend church services with Hose's family, but she couldn't ask the congregation for help. She had learned, through years of conditioning, that survival meant invisibility. Until one day, she couldn't stay invisible anymore. In 2005, Thomas Hose allowed Tanya to take a part-time job at a small convenience store called JJ's Deli Mart, located a few blocks from the house. It was the first time in nearly a decade that she had regular contact with people outside Hose's control. The store was owned by Joe and Janet Sparico, a middle-aged couple who treated their employees with kindness and respect. When Tanya started working there, they noticed she was quiet, almost painfully shy, and seemed nervous around customers. But she was reliable, showed up on time, and worked hard. At first, Tanya kept entirely to herself. She stocked shelves, operated the register, and avoided conversations beyond the necessary transactions with customers. The world outside felt overwhelming after so many years of isolation. Too many voices, too many faces, too much stimulation. But over the months, she began to relax slightly around the Sparicos. Janet would ask how her day was going. Joe would make jokes about the weather or complain good-naturedly about supplier deliveries. They were warm, patient, and never demanded more from her than she was comfortable giving. Tanya watched them carefully. She observed the way Joe and Janet interacted with each other, the casual affection, the easy banter, the way they worked together as partners. It was the first healthy relationship she had witnessed in years, and it created a profound dissonance. She began to realize, slowly and painfully, that what she had with Hose was not normal. It was not a relationship. It was not love. It was captivity. The realization didn't come all at once. It built gradually, through small observations and accumulating awareness. She noticed how other people her age talked about their lives, their plans, their freedom. She noticed that other young women weren't afraid to speak, weren't constantly looking over their shoulders, weren't living under someone else's control. She started to understand that she had been robbed, not just of 10 years, but of her childhood, her adolescence, her identity, her choices. Everything that should have been hers had been taken. By early 2006, Tanya had begun thinking seriously about escape. Not in the abstract way she had thought about it years earlier, when escape seemed impossible, but in concrete, practical terms. She started paying attention to phone numbers, to addresses, to the routines of the store. She rehearsed conversations in her head, imagining what she would say if she could find the courage to speak. On March 20th, 2006, something inside her finally broke through the fear. She arrived at JJ's Deli Mart for her shift that morning feeling different. Not brave, exactly, but ready. After 10 years of silence, she was going to use her voice. She worked through the morning, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. When Joe Sparico came into the store to check on inventory, she made a decision. She walked toward him, her mouth dry, her mind racing with everything Hose had told her over the years. All the threats, all the warnings, all the reasons she should stay silent. She ignored them all. "Joe," she said quietly, "can I talk to you?" He looked up, noticing the tension in her voice. "Of course. What's wrong?" She took a breath. "My name isn't Nikki Allen." Joe frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "My real name is Tanya Kach," she said, the words coming faster now. "I've been missing since 1996. I've been living with Tom Hose. He's been keeping me at his house. I haven't been allowed to leave." Joe stared at her, stunned. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The story sounded impossible. But the look on her face, the fear and desperation in her eyes, told him this wasn't a joke or a delusion. "If you go to the website for missing children," she continued, her voice trembling. "You'll find me there. My picture, from when I was 14. Joe nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Stay here. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to make some calls." He walked to the back office and immediately called his son, a former police officer, who advised him to contact authorities right away. He then called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children hotline and explained the situation. Within minutes, the information was verified. Tanya Nicole Kach, reported missing from McKeesport, Pennsylvania on February 14, 1996, was standing in a convenience store 2 miles from where she had disappeared. Police arrived within the hour. Officers approached Tanya carefully, understanding the trauma she had endured. They asked her to confirm her identity, her date of birth, her father's name. She answered each question. They compared her face to the old missing person photograph and to the age progression images created years earlier. It was her. She was taken to the police station, where detectives interviewed her for hours. She told them everything. The grooming at school, running away, the 4 years locked in a bedroom, the new identity, the decade of control and manipulation, the threats that kept her silent. At 5 p.m. that evening, officers went to Thomas Hose's residence and arrested him. He was still at work, still employed as a security guard at Cornell Middle School, still in a position where he had access to children. When they took him into custody, he remained silent. His face showed no emotion as they read him his rights. Back at the station, Tanya waited. A victim advocate stayed with her, explaining what would happen next, but Tanya was barely listening. Her mind was reeling. After 10 years of being told that escape was impossible, that no one would believe her, that speaking would only bring punishment, she had finally used her voice. And people had listened. Then the door opened, and her father walked in. Jerry Kach had been at home when the police called. At first, he thought it was another false lead, another reported sighting that would lead nowhere. He had received dozens of such calls over the years, each one raising hopes that were inevitably crushed. But this time, the officer on the phone said something different. "Mr. Kach, we've found your daughter. She's here at the station. She's safe." Jerry's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the kitchen floor, phone pressed to his ear, unable to speak. For 10 years, he had imagined this moment. He had prayed for it, dreamed about it, held on to it through every disappointment. Now that it was real, he couldn't process it. "Mr. Kach, are you there?" "I'm coming," Jerry managed to say. "I'm coming right now." He drove to the police station in a daze, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Joanne sat beside him in silence, both of them afraid to believe it was true until they saw her with their own eyes. At the station, an officer led them to a small interview room, and there she was. Tanya sat in a chair, looking small and tired. She was 24 years old now, no longer the 14-year-old girl who had walked out of his house a decade ago. Her face was thinner, her eyes harder, but it was her. "Tanya," Jerry said, his voice breaking. She stood up slowly. Tears were already streaming down her face. "Dad." They met in the middle of the room. Jerry pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as they both cried. "I got my baby back," he kept saying. "I got my baby back." For Tanya, it was the first time in 10 years she had heard those words. The first time someone had held her without control or manipulation. The first time she felt, truly felt, that someone was happy she existed. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "No," Jerry said firmly, pulling back to look at her. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. Do you understand me?" She nodded, but she wasn't sure she believed it. She had spent 10 years being told she was at fault, that she had made the choice to leave, that everything that happened was her responsibility. Those messages didn't disappear just because someone said they weren't true. The reunion was emotional and overwhelming, but it was also the beginning of a much longer, much more difficult journey. Jerry had his daughter back, but the girl who returned was not the same girl who had left. She had been shaped by trauma, by captivity, by years of psychological manipulation. The road ahead would be complicated. In the days following Tanya's escape, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. Detectives interviewed her extensively, documenting every detail of her captivity. They searched Thomas Hose's house, collecting evidence that would later be used in court. What they found was disturbing. In Hose's bedroom, investigators discovered calendars and notebooks containing detailed records. Hose had documented his crimes meticulously, keeping track of dates and frequency with disturbing precision. He had shown these records to friends and coworkers over the years, presenting them as evidence of an active relationship, never revealing that the woman he was talking about was a missing child he had taken from her family. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic predation and control. Hose had groomed a vulnerable 14-year-old student, convinced her to run away, and then held her captive for a decade through a combination of physical confinement and psychological manipulation. Detectives also interviewed Hose's parents and adult son. All of them claimed they had no idea Tanya had been held against her will. They knew her as Nikki Allen, their son's girlfriend, a quiet young woman who lived with them. They insisted they had never seen signs of captivity or distress. The question of whether Hose's family members genuinely didn't know or simply chose not to see remains unanswered. How could a teenage girl live in a house for 4 years, locked in a bedroom, without the family noticing? The investigation found no evidence that Hose's parents were complicit, but the situation raised troubling questions about willful blindness. The media coverage was intense and immediate. By the day after Tanya's escape, her story was national news. Cameras crowded outside the police station. Reporters interviewed neighbors, school officials, anyone connected to the case. The headlines were sensational. Woman held captive for 10 years, found living 2 miles from father. Pennsylvania woman escapes decade of captivity. Security guard arrested in shocking case. Public reaction was mixed and often harsh. While many people expressed sympathy for Tanya, others questioned why she hadn't escaped sooner. Why didn't she scream for help? Why didn't she run when she had opportunities? Why didn't she go with Hose in the first place? These questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of grooming, psychological manipulation, and trauma. People struggled to comprehend how someone could be held captive without visible chains, how control could be psychological rather than just physical. Experts in trauma and manipulation tried to explain. They talked about how grooming works, how predators isolate victims and break down their sense of agency, how prolonged captivity creates a condition where escape feels impossible even when physical barriers are removed. But for many observers, the explanations weren't satisfying. They wanted captivity to look a certain way: locked doors, physical restraints, dramatic escape attempts. Tanya's story didn't fit that narrative, so they blamed her for it. Thomas Hose was charged with multiple offenses: 3 counts of involuntary deviate intercourse, 1 count of statutory offense, 2 counts of aggravated indecent contact, interference with custody of a child, corruption of a minor, and endangering the welfare of a child. Notably absent from the charges was kidnapping. Prosecutors determined that because Tanya had initially accompanied Hose willingly, believing his promise of a better life, the legal definition of kidnapping didn't apply. It was a technicality that would frustrate many who followed the case, but it reflected the complexity of proving a crime where psychological manipulation rather than physical force was the primary tool of captivity. Hose's defense attorney, James Ecker, argued that his client was not guilty of the most serious charges. The defense strategy centered on portraying Tanya as a willing participant who had made her own choices and later regretted them. They claimed she had stayed with Hose voluntarily, that she had opportunities to leave and didn't take them, and that there was no evidence of force or physical restraint. It was a strategy that placed the burden of proof on Tanya, requiring her to demonstrate that she had been held against her will in ways that satisfied legal definitions, even though the nature of her captivity made that difficult to prove in conventional terms. The prosecution built their case carefully. They presented the detailed records Hose had kept, demonstrating the systematic nature of his crimes. They presented testimony from Joe Sparico about Tanya's fear and desperation when she finally revealed her identity. They brought in experts on trauma and manipulation to explain how psychological captivity works. Most importantly, they presented Tanya herself. She testified for hours, recounting the decade of captivity in careful detail. She described the grooming that started at school, the promises Hose made to convince her to leave, the 4 years locked in a bedroom, the threats that kept her silent. She spoke calmly, her voice steady, though the emotional toll was evident. When the defense cross-examined her, they focused on one central question. If she was being held captive, why didn't she escape when she had opportunities? Tanya's answer was direct. He convinced me that I couldn't. That's what manipulation does. It makes you believe that the only option you have is to stay. In June 2007, facing substantial evidence and the likelihood of a lengthy trial, Thomas Hose accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of involuntary deviate intercourse, aggravated indecent contact, statutory offense, interference with custody, corruption of a minor, and endangering the welfare of a child. At his sentencing hearing, Hose attempted to address the court. "I'd like to say I'm sorry," he began. He tried to suggest that he had helped Tanya, that she had once thanked him for saving her from a worse fate. Judge John Zatola interrupted him sharply. "I think you give yourself too much credit," the judge said. "You see yourself as different than the rest of the world sees you." Judge Zatola sentenced Hose to 5 to 15 years in state prison. The sentence reflected the plea agreement and sentencing guidelines, but to many observers, it seemed inadequate for a decade of captivity and abuse. Hose's attorney told reporters he was satisfied with the outcome, noting his client had faced much longer sentences if convicted at trial. For Tanya, there was no satisfaction. The man who had controlled her life for 10 years would serve, at most, 15 years. It wasn't justice. It was a conclusion. In February 2022, after serving his complete 15-year sentence, Thomas Hose was released from prison. He returned to the McKeesport area, registered as an offender as required by law, and moved into a residential facility. When Tanya learned of his release, she spoke to reporters about her fear. "This person is getting out," she said. "After what he has done, I am scared." She was 40 years old, 15 years removed from her captivity, and the man who had stolen her childhood was free. The reunion between Tanya and her father, so emotional and hopeful in those first hours, began to fracture within weeks. Jerry and Joan struggled to understand what had happened to Tanya. They asked questions that revealed their confusion and, sometimes, their skepticism. "Why didn't you call? Why didn't you tell someone at the store? Why did you go with him in the first place?" To them, these seemed like reasonable questions. They were trying to make sense of something that defied logic. But to Tanya, the questions felt like accusations, like she was being blamed for her own victimization. The tension grew. Jerry and Joan couldn't comprehend how someone could be held captive for 10 years without physically escaping. They saw only the surface, a young woman who had opportunities to leave and seemingly didn't take them. They didn't understand the psychological mechanisms that make escape feel impossible, the way prolonged manipulation rewires a victim's sense of agency and possibility. "You knew what you were doing," Jerry said during one particularly painful conversation. The words devastated Tanya. "Dad, I was 14, she replied, tears streaming down her face. But the damage was done. The relationship that Tanya had dreamed about during her captivity, the father who would understand and support her unconditionally, didn't match the reality of Jerry's confusion and doubt. Publicly, Jerry continued to support his daughter. He gave interviews defending her, expressing gratitude that she was alive, insisting that he believed her account. But privately, doubt lingered. Joan was more openly skeptical, telling friends and neighbors that parts of Tanya's story didn't add up. Tanya moved out of her father's house within weeks of returning. She found her own apartment and began trying to rebuild her life independently. The physical distance reflected the emotional chasm that had opened between them. She also reconnected briefly with her biological mother, Sherry, who had remarried and built a new life during Tanya's decade of absence. The reunion was emotional but awkward, marked by years of estrangement and a relationship that had been fractured even before Tanya disappeared. They tried, but the connection never fully formed. By the end of 2006, Tanya was effectively estranged from most of her family. The people she had spent 10 years hoping to return to no longer felt like home. The reunion she had imagined had become another form of loss. In 2011, Tanya published a book titled Memoir of a Milk Carton Kid, the Tanya Nicole Kach story. It was an honest, unflinching account of her captivity and her life before and after. In it, she wrote about her childhood, about feeling neglected and unwanted, about the family dynamics that had made her vulnerable to predation. She didn't write the book to hurt anyone. She wrote it to tell her truth, to help other survivors, to raise awareness about grooming and institutional failures. But in June 2012, Jerry and Joan Kach filed a legal action against Tanya, claiming certain statements in her book were harmful to their reputation. When Tanya received the legal papers, she was devastated. "Why this is happening, I don't know," she told reporters, her voice breaking. "It breaks my heart." The legal matter was eventually resolved, but the relationship was permanently destroyed. Tanya and her father never reconciled. The estrangement became final. Years later, when asked about it, Tanya said simply, "I tried with my dad. I tried so hard. It breaks my heart every day." Life after captivity is not a linear journey toward healing. It's a complicated, painful process of learning to exist in a world that feels foreign and overwhelming. Tanya struggled with trauma-related conditions that affected every aspect of her life. She had nightmares where she was back in the bedroom, where the door was locked again, where escape was impossible. She woke up disoriented, unsure for terrifying moments whether she was free or still trapped. She had lost 10 years. 10 years of education, of normal social development, of learning to navigate the world as an independent person. She had to start from scratch, learning things most people her age had mastered years earlier. She got her GED and took community college courses. She worked various jobs, trying to support herself while managing trauma that affected her concentration, her relationships, her ability to trust. Every interaction felt like a risk. Every moment of vulnerability felt dangerous. Dating was particularly difficult. How do you trust someone when the person who destroyed your life positioned himself as your protector? How do you distinguish between kindness and manipulation when they once looked identical? She cycled through several therapists before finding one who specialized in complex trauma and understood the unique challenges of prolonged captivity. Therapy helped, but progress was slow and nonlinear. Some days, she felt stronger. Other days, the weight of what she had endured felt crushing. But slowly, incrementally, she began to reclaim herself. She started writing, not just about her past, but about her present and future. She decorated her apartment, creating a space that was entirely hers. She adopted a pet. She learned to cook. She celebrated small victories, sleeping through the night, going to the grocery store alone, speaking up in a group without panicking. She learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or getting over it. It means learning to carry the weight of trauma while still building a life worth living. In the years following her escape, Tanya transformed her pain into purpose. She became an advocate for survivors of predatory violence, grooming, and captivity. She began speaking at schools, community centers, and conferences, sharing her story and educating others about how predators operate. Her message was clear and urgent. Predators don't look like monsters. They look like teachers, coaches, security guards, trusted community members. They groomed their victims slowly, building trust before exploiting it. They isolate, manipulate, and control, and they rely on society's disbelief to protect them. She spoke about the warning signs of grooming: an adult who singles out a vulnerable child, who offers special attention and gifts, who creates situations to be alone with the child, who gradually introduces inappropriate behavior while making the child feel special and chosen. She educated audiences about why victims don't just leave. She explained how psychological manipulation works, how predators systematically break down a victim's sense of agency, how prolonged captivity creates conditions where escape feels impossible even when physical barriers are removed. She challenged victim-blaming attitudes, addressing directly the question she had faced: why didn't you scream? Why didn't you run? She helped audiences understand that survival, sometimes looks like compliance, that trauma responses are complex, that judgment from outsiders only compound the harm. She worked with organizations focused on missing children, trafficking prevention, and survivor support. She lobbied for legislative changes, including extending statutes of limitations for certain offenses and improving training for school personnel to recognize grooming behaviors. Her advocacy work was not easy. Every time she told her story publicly, she relived the trauma. Every interview, every speech required her to revisit the darkest period of her life. But she did it because she believed it mattered. "If my story can save even one child," she said in an interview, "then everything I went through has meaning." She became a lifeline for other survivors, people who reached out to her after hearing her speak or reading her book. They shared their own stories of grooming, manipulation, and captivity. They told her that hearing her story helped them understand their own experiences, helped them feel less alone, helped them find the courage to speak. For Tanya, connecting with other survivors became an essential part of her own healing. She wasn't just helping them. They were helping her, reminding her that she wasn't alone either, that survival was possible, that speaking truth mattered. Tanya Nicole Kach disappeared in 1996 at the age of 14. For 10 years, she lived in captivity just 2 miles from her father's home, hidden in plain sight while her face stared out from missing person flyers on telephone poles across Pennsylvania. Her case exposed devastating truths about how predators operate, how institutions fail to protect vulnerable children, and how society's misunderstanding of manipulation and trauma compounds the harm experienced by survivors. When Tanya finally escaped in 2006, she discovered that freedom was not the end of her struggle. It was the beginning of a different fight, a fight to be believed, to be understood, to reclaim her identity, to build a life from ruins. The road has been long and painful. She lost her childhood, her adolescence, and 10 years of her life that can never be recovered. Her family relationships fractured under the weight of trauma and misunderstanding. The legal system delivered a resolution that felt inadequate. The man who stole her childhood served 15 years and was released. But Tanya refused to let those losses define her entire story. She found her voice in a convenience store on March 20th, 2006, when she told Joe Sparico her real name. That single act of courage saved her life, and she has continued using her voice ever since to educate, to advocate, to fight for other children and survivors who need someone to speak for them. Her advocacy has contributed to increased awareness about grooming, improved training for educators and law enforcement, and legislative reforms aimed at better protecting children. Her willingness to share her story has helped countless survivors understand their own experiences and find the courage to speak their truth. Tanya's story is not a fairy tale. It doesn't end with perfect healing or complete justice, but it is a testament to human resilience, to the power of speaking truth, to the possibility of building a meaningful life even after devastating trauma. Today, Tanya lives quietly, continuing her healing journey and her advocacy work. She has found moments of joy and peace. She has built connections with people who support and believe her. She has created a life that is entirely her own. Her message to other survivors is simple but profound. You are not alone. Your trauma is real. Speaking your truth matters. Healing is possible. And her message to the rest of us is equally important. Believe survivors. Educate yourselves about how predators operate. Protect the vulnerable children in your communities. And never stop fighting for justice. If this story matters to you, share it. Spread awareness. Support organizations that protect children and assist survivors. Because somewhere right now, another child is trapped in silence, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to believe. Let's make sure we're listening.